Welcome everyone, I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. In this live stream, I'll be talking about Paul Ricoeur and how he spars, we could say figuratively, with Edmund Husserl's phenomenological idealism. And thinking about Ricoeur in contrast to Husserl, whose battle cry toward a kind of recuperation of objectivity was to the things themselves, said Husserl. For Ricoeur, we could think of him saying to the words themselves, to the texts themselves, to the contexts themselves. So Ricoeur is concerned about interpretation, hermeneutics, in relation to the givenness won by Husserl, taken up by Heidegger. And with Heidegger, we get a bit more layers of hermeneutics, hermeneutical understanding of lived experience as Ereignis, the event of the appropriation of meaning by Dasein. And Ricoeur also wants to consider Dasein very carefully, though he won't restrict talking about subjectivity to the terminology of Dasein. So I want to take some texts of Husserl and Ricoeur's response to these and really think about the phenomenology of Paul Ricoeur, the hermeneutical phenomenology of Paul Ricoeur. So we can say that Ricoeur directly assumes Heidegger's advancements of the interpretive process in his critique of Husserlian idealism. Whereas for Husserl, now this is a quote from his 1907 Göttingen lectures called The Idea of Phenomenology. Husserl writes, to each psychic lived process, there corresponds, through the device of phenomenological reduction, a pure phenomenon, which exhibits its intrinsic or immanent essence, taken individually, as an absolute datum. So this is what Husserl is getting at, that to each psychic lived process, each noetic act of consciousness, there corresponds, through the device of the phenomenological reduction, through the epoche, the bracketing of the natural attitude, there corresponds to the noesis a noema, a pure phenomenon, which gives itself essentially and immanently, we could even say intimately, as an absolute datum for consciousness. I love how people sometimes talk the word intimacy in English. It's like saying into me, see. Into me, see. This is what phenomenology is doing with subjectivity. We're looking inside the self. It's a matter of interiority, first with Husserl. And then Paul Ricoeur is going to then think about exteriority in relation to the interiority of subjectivity. So Ricoeur will say in hermeneutics and the human sciences that all phenomenology is an explication of evidence, an evidence of explication. What does he mean there? That there's no pure phenomenon without some kind of interpretation and subsequent description. We don't get a pure phenomenon without reading it as such. To read our own experience, our own lived experience, is this explication, this act of interpretation, understanding, description, explicating. But we notice the language in English translation here, explicate, the X rather than the in. Thinking about this exterior movement of response and receptivity, that intentionality is active after all in relation to intuition. Ricoeur says further that all phenomenology, in spite of its intuitive kernel, lived experiences remain always interpretations of phenomena. This is something quite different than Husserl, again, Husserl, in the idea of phenomenology, says that we also find in the case of the phenomenon of perception what we found in the case of consciousness of universals, namely that it is a consciousness which constitutes something self-given, which is not contained within what is occurring in the world and is not at all found as cogitatio. So, what is Husserl talking about? The pure phenomenon. The pure phenomenon cannot be reduced as to an act of the cogito. It can't be reduced to what consciousness is doing. So Husserl says, thus, as little interpretation as possible. This is Husserl. This is the origin of the method of phenomenology. As little interpretation as possible. Why does he say that? Because if we interpret too much, we lose the purity of the givenness of the phenomenon. So first comes givenness. And Ricoeur, in some ways, would concede that point, would agree. But at the same time, Ricoeur says with every experience, there's also simultaneously the interpreting subject, the agency of interpretation that we talk about as intentionality within phenomenology. But for Husserl, he says as little interpretation as possible, but as pure an intuition as possible. Intuitio sine comprehensione. Intuition without comprehension, even. This is phenomenological givenness. This is what Marion really emphasizes in his work. This intuitio sine comprehensione. That's a Latin phrase, intuition without comprehension. As pure intuition as possible. This is the original quest of phenomenology. But Husserl says further, in fact, we will hark back to the speech of the mystics when they describe the intellectual seeing, which is supposed not to be a discursive knowledge. And we see this with, at least I'm most familiar with the Christian mystics, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Therese of Lisieux, the Carmelites, Catherine of Siena, Hildegard of Bingen, Bridget of Sweden, all of these various mystical figures, Meister Eckhart, what's happening with them? So there's an intellectual seeing which they describe not as what would be called a prayer of meditation, discursive reasoning, thinking of this and then that and using the imagination, but rather intellectual seeing it's immediate. It brings this purity that the intellect itself cannot supply through sense perception. It's such interiority there. It's such a purification and detachment from things exterior to the soul, you could say. So Husserl is saying that what he's after in this phenomenology of givenness and this transcendental reduction to eidetic objectivity is something similar to what we find in the mystical life, in the experience of religious faith. Though he doesn't say that's what his phenomenology is, but he's analogous to it. Husserl says further in the idea of phenomenology, and the whole trick consists in this, to give free rein to the seeing eye and to bracket the references which go beyond the seeing and are entangled with the seeing. So we notice his language there. It's a predilection for seeing as thought as seeing. It's very Platonic, thinking of the allegory of the cave. We see the light and see things in the light. And so it's a concept of vision here. But he's saying we don't want the purity of seeing, the purity of the phenomenon to be entangled within these hermeneutical matrices. We want to clear the clutter of hermeneutics and interpretation to receive the purity of the phenomenon through a pure intellectual vision of thought. So we can think about Husserl's phenomenology as mystical. It's a mystical way to think and to approach the world. It's very contemplative. So Husserl says that we need to go beyond the seeing and its entanglements, along with the entities which are supposedly given and thought along with the seeing. What he's saying, the symbolic order of seeing that brings with it all past lived experiences. And finally, to bracket what is read into these new lived experiences through the accompanying reflections. So again, like Marion says, so much reduction, so much givenness, so much phenomenological reduction of the natural attitude, so much givenness, so much receptivity, so much clarity and purification of the, we could say, unadulterated phenomenon giving itself as itself by itself. So that's Husserl. But again, Ricoeur is saying that in spite of this intuitive kernel of phenomenological givenness, lived experience, again, not just as Erlebnis, but with Heidegger, Ereignis, there's an appropriation of meaning happening here, an event of appropriation, which is to say at once interpretation. Lived experience remains an interpretation. We can't deny the fact. We have to come clean about it. So instead of positing the transcendental ego as the indubitable foundation of phenomenality, Ricoeur insists that a self is given to the ego by the text, by the context, by all of these hermeneutical layers of meaning making, according to the universal power of world disclosure borne by the text. As Heidegger said, language is the house of being. And for Ricoeur, he agrees that the text, the textuality of experience, all the meanings that we bring to every newly received meaning, the text itself brings with it a universal power of world disclosure, the breaking open of the Umwelt, es weltet, the world worlds itself to the self, giving the self to itself through this textuality, not just of givenness, but of signification. And so in Ricoeur, we have not so much a visual concept of thoughts, but an oral one, a spoken one. Speech, language, witness, testimony, and a kind of oral receptivity of perception. So for Ricoeur, language serves as the medium between the teleological ideal of logicity, of logic, and the mute elemental experience proceeding from an Ursprung, we say in German, a ground, an origin, a soil, a springing forth of meaning. So language is the medium between the goals of logic and sense making. We want to understand a thing after all. We want to know what something is and differentiate it from other things. We want to have some kind of intellectual grasp of a thing. This is what the intellect wants. So there's the teleological ideal of logic, the goal of it on one hand, but the mute elemental experience that Husserl is trying to get at on the other, and language is the bridge between them. Language is the way we make sense of things after all. So just as in Heidegger, every experience occurs within a world that gives a totality of references. And in German, this totality of references, Bewandtnisganzheit. Bewandtnisganzheit. Totality of references, constellation of meaning. Every experience occurs within a world that already has many stars, of which we make constellations, of which we're already connecting the dots. Having the structure of meaningfulness, Bedeutsamkeit. In Ricoeur, both subject and phenomenon are encompassed by the ontological conditions of finitude and belonging. So this is categories that Ricoeur teases out more for his part, the meaning of finitude and the meaning of belonging. That we have an innate yearning as human subjects to belong to a community of interpreters, to belong to this totality of references and constellation of meaning that results in meaningfulness, something to live into. In other words, Ricoeur transposes Heidegger's notion of being in the world to the relation of belonging. I belong in the world after all, inasmuch as I am living into it. A human subject and world are placed face to face in a relation that is at once particular, historical, and textual. We can't get around that. So Husserl has gleaned much with this passionate quest for eidetic objectivity. And Heidegger has expanded the horizon of this phenomenological understanding of how we receive not just generic givenness, but above all, the givenness of Sein in and through all the phenomena that light up within our lived experience, and our work as Dasein to appropriate those meanings within lived experience according to a coherent whole. So Ricoeur says that within this being in the world, we recognize a relation of belonging to what is particular, historical, and textual. So Ricoeur emphasizes intentionality over against elemental intuition. As he writes in his book, Hermeneutics and the Human Sciences, the Husserlian demand for the return to intuition is countered by the necessity for all understanding to be mediated by an interpretation. So Ricoeur is very much, again, focusing on the art of interpretation, the fact of interpretation, the history of interpretation. So whenever we're doing philosophy, we are automatically and immediately interpreting our lived experience. And we're interpreting the history of philosophy. We're constantly interpreting. It's, I don't want to say impossible because that would betray phenomenology. Or as Heidegger says, possibility stands higher than actuality. But maybe as close to impossible as we can get is Husserl's quest for the pure phenomenon as such. Ricoeur wants to underline not the such, but the as. As such. A phenomenon gives itself as such. Heidegger says that every phenomenon gives itself etwas als etwas, something as something. And the phenomenological as is the very act of ereigness, of interpretation, and an appropriation of meaning within the lived experience. This is not only the case for a symbol phenomenon, but for Ricoeur, the cosmos itself is saturated with symbolic meanings. As Ricoeur says, the symbolic